There is a moment, often quiet, often unnoticed by others, when something inside you snaps. But not in anger, not in fear, in clarity. A switch flips. You stop waiting for someone to understand you. You stop needing others to see your side. You stop explaining your intentions to people who were never listening in the first place. Something in you says, I don't care if you approve of me. I'm not here to earn your applause. And just like that, you become dangerous. Not loud, not aggressive, not cruel, but untouchable. Because the world has no hold over a person who no longer seeks its validation. But before we go deeper, write down in the comments where you're watching this from. Let's see who's waking up, because this message isn't for the naive or the soft-hearted. It's for those who've been burned, lied to, used, misunderstood, and still chose to rise. This is for the ones who realized the game was never going to be fair and decided to stop playing by its rules. Carl Jung knew this territory well. In his view, the greatest psychological prison is not built from trauma, failure, or even rejection. It's built from the chronic need to be liked. What Jung called the persona is the mask we wear to survive. It's the polite version of you, the agreeable version, the version that knows when to stay quiet to keep the peace, when to smile through discomfort, when to compromise your values just to stay connected. The persona is a performance designed not to be authentic, but to be acceptable. It's how you get love in a world that punishes honesty. But here's the problem. The more you wear that mask, the more you lose touch with who you really are underneath it. And soon, you start confusing approval with identity. You base your worth on feedback. You start chasing likes instead of peace. You begin molding your thoughts, your behavior, your entire self around what will win you favor in the eyes of others. Jung saw this not as kindness, but as fragmentation. Because every time you betray your truth for acceptance, you split off from yourself. You become a collection of roles, not a person. This is not compassion. This is self-erasure. And here's what most people don't realize. The world doesn't reward those who bend to fit. It uses them. The agreeable are expected to agree. The nice ones are expected to tolerate. The ones who never say no are kept around as tools, not as people. Jung understood that the cost of needing validation is your soul, your direction, your voice. You become easy to manipulate, because all someone has to do is threaten to disapprove, and you'll fold. You'll apologize for things that aren't your fault. You'll compromise your boundaries to avoid disappointing someone who never respected them to begin with. But then something happens. Slowly, painfully, inevitably, you hit a wall. You realize you've contorted yourself for people who would never do the same for you. You see how often you've been quiet when you should have spoken, how many times you've smiled through disrespect just to keep someone comfortable. And that's when it starts to burn, the shame, the resentment, the exhaustion, until you can't do it anymore, until one day you say, enough. And that day, that's the beginning of your power, the beginning of emotional freedom. Because when you stop needing their validation, you stop being controlled. Your self-worth no longer sits in someone else's hands. You don't chase, you don't explain, you don't beg to be chosen. You simply choose yourself. That's the kind of dangerous Jung was talking about. Not dangerous to others, but dangerous to systems of control, to people who depended on your silence, to the world that taught you to stay small. No one is born needing the world's validation. That hunger is taught. It's learned slowly over years of subtle conditioning, sometimes even by the people who loved us most. From the moment we're old enough to be scolded, we're taught to associate approval with safety. A child expresses anger and gets punished. A child cries too loud and is told to stop. A child says what they really feel and gets the look. You know the one. The look that says, be quieter, be easier, be more likable. And so, the child learns. Approval equals love. Love equals survival. So what do? They adapt. They become the version of themselves that gets smiles instead of silence, praise instead of tension. Carl Jung believed that this is where the fracture begins. The moment we split into two selves, the true self and the social self. The social self learns to say the right things, feel the right emotions, carry the right image. And the true self? It gets buried, hidden, silenced. Because that's the part that might upset someone. That's the part that might be too much. You grow up, but the wiring doesn't change. You enter relationships still trying to earn affection. You stay quiet in meetings because you don't want to come off arrogant. You say yes when you want to say no, because disappointing someone feels like a risk your nervous system was trained not to take. You keep playing the role, thinking that maybe if you play it well enough, someone will finally see the real you. But that's the catch. They can't. You've been performing for so long, you don't even realize when you're doing it anymore. And this isn't your fault. The need for validation is deeply human. We are wired to connect, wired to belong. But what Jung challenges us to ask is this: belong to what? To who? At what cost? Because when your belonging depends on self-betrayal, that's not connection, that's captivity. Most people never question it. They go their whole lives adjusting themselves for others' comfort, believing that keeping the peace is the same as being at peace. It's not. That kind of peace is a cage, a quiet one, a socially approved one, but a cage all the same. The danger of seeking validation isn't just that you'll be manipulated. It's that you'll never meet yourself. You'll become what everyone else needs and forget what you need. You'll be liked by many, but known by none. And the longer you live like this, the harder it becomes to remember who you were before you started pretending. Jung's work urges us to remember, not just intellectually, but emotionally, spiritually, viscerally. Because the only way out of this trap is to bring the buried self back into the light. That's where real power begins. But before we get there, we need to look at the mechanics of this system, how society benefits from your insecurity, how culture rewards conformity, and why breaking free makes you so dangerous. Validation is no longer a luxury in modern society, it's a weapon, and the world has learned how to use it against you. From childhood, you're trained to associate approval with safety. A smile from a parent, a gold star in school, a like on your latest photo. The reward system gets baked into your nervous system until it runs on autopilot. You don't even realize it's happening. You begin to adjust your tone, your opinions, your decisions, not because they reflect who you are, but because you fear the cost of being rejected. You become a walking performance, trying to stay on the right side of other people's expectations. Carl Jung understood this long before social media made it obvious. He observed that most people never develop a real personality. They just refine a persona. The persona is the social mask we wear to be accepted by the collective. And over time, the mask becomes more important than the face beneath it. You forget what you like, what you believe, what you want. Not because you never had those answers, but because they became too risky to express. You traded authenticity for approval. And the tragedy is, most people don't even notice the exchange. But here's the truth that society won't tell you. People who need validation are easy to manipulate. They're easy to market to, easy to shame, easy to silence. Because all you have to do is threaten what they crave. Disapproval becomes a cage. The fear of being disliked, dismissed, or seen as difficult keeps them quiet, tame, controlled. And this is how entire systems maintain power, through people who are too afraid to stop playing along. Jung warned us about this trap. He said that until you make the unconscious conscious, it will rule your life, and you will call it fate. The unconscious, in this case, is your need to be seen a certain way. It's your dependence on being liked. And as long as that need controls you, your choices will never truly be your own. You'll spend your life managing your image instead of becoming yourself. But something radical happens when you no longer care if people like you, not out of spite, not because you've turned bitter or cold, but because you've realized that no amount of external validation will ever replace the feeling of inner alignment. When your words match your values, when your choices reflect your truth, when your peace no longer depends on anyone's applause. That kind of self-possession is rare and dangerous, because once you find it, you stop asking for permission to exist. You stop laughing at things that aren't funny. You stop agreeing just to keep the peace. You stop giving access to people who only value you when you're convenient. You stop explaining your boundaries. You stop shrinking to make others comfortable. And that's when the shift happens. People sense that they can't control you anymore. And in a world where most relationships are power negotiations disguised as affection, your refusal to play makes you a threat. You don't need to shout. You don't need to argue. Your stillness alone will say everything. Because when you're no longer moved by approval or rattled by rejection, you become something this world rarely encounters: free. There's a silent war happening around you every day, not one fought with weapons or fists, but with perceptions, opinions, and judgments. A war over your identity, over who you're supposed to be, the way you speak, what you believe, how you show up in the world. Society, culture, family, even strangers online, they all carry subtle expectations about how you should behave. And whether you realize it or not, every time you tailor yourself to fit into one of those molds, you lose something. A little piece of your authenticity gets edited out, and over time, the cost adds up. Carl Jung called this self-alienation, the process of becoming so deeply entangled in the external world that you forget you even have an internal one. You become a collage of other people's desires, a product of projection. And here's the sinister part. Society rewards you for this. You'll be told you're well-adjusted, likable, easygoing, even admirable, when in reality, you're just easy to digest, easy to direct, easy to control. This is how most people live, not because they're weak, but because it's safer. Validation feels like protection. It keeps you from being questioned, attacked, or cast out. But that safety is an illusion, because what you're really protecting isn't yourself, it's the role you've been assigned. The minute you stop performing that role, you'll see how conditional the acceptance really was. And this is where things get dangerous for them. The moment you withdraw from the game of approval, you change the dynamic completely. You no longer respond to guilt trips. You stop explaining your decisions. You stop softening your truth so others can feel comfortable. Suddenly, the people who once felt confident in controlling you start to panic because their influence depended on your compliance. Their power was tied to your need for affirmation. And when that need dies, so does their grip on you. Jung believed that true individuality begins with this rupture, with a confrontation between the persona and the shadow. The persona, that curated mask you show the world. The shadow, everything you suppress to keep that mask intact. Emotional detachment doesn't mean apathy, it means you've stopped outsourcing your worth. It means you've looked at your shadow and decided you'd rather be whole than socially polished. You've chosen authenticity over approval. That's not cruelty, that's sovereignty. So when people say you've changed, when they call you distant, cold, arrogant, it's not really about you. It's about the mirror you've become. Your detachment reflects their dependence. Your self-assurance exposes their insecurity. And your refusal to chase their validation feels like rejection, even if you've said nothing at all. This is why the most dangerous person isn't the loudest or the most aggressive. It's the one who's no longer reactive, the one who no longer flinches when you disapprove, the one who knows what they stand for and doesn't need anyone else to agree. That kind of presence doesn't ask for power, it radiates it. There's a moment in the journey of individuation when something subtle but irreversible happens. You stop apologizing, not because you've become rude or inconsiderate, but because you finally understand the difference between guilt and responsibility. You begin to recognize how often you've been guilted into submission, guilted into silence, guilted into being smaller so that someone else could feel bigger. And you see it clearly now, that guilt was never yours. It was assigned to you by people who needed your compliance to feel in control. Carl Jung warned about this exact mechanism. He saw how easily the human psyche could be conditioned into servitude, not with chains, but with emotional manipulation. The fear of disappointing others, the anxiety of being misunderstood, the instinct to maintain harmony at the cost of your own clarity. These are the tools used by insecure people to keep you manageable, to keep you seeking their approval instead of seeking your truth. But once you stop seeking validation, those tools lose their edge. You stop explaining your no's. You stop softening your boundaries to seem more agreeable. And most importantly, you stop trying to fix the discomfort others feel when they can no longer control you. That's when people start calling you difficult, distant, or selfish. Not because you've become any of those things, but because you've stopped allowing your emotions to be dictated by theirs. This is emotional detachment in its highest form, not coldness, but composure. You're no longer addicted to being liked. You're committed to being aligned. And alignment doesn't always look nice. Sometimes it means cutting ties with people you once loved. Sometimes it means being the villain in someone else's story because you finally chose to write your own. That choice doesn't come without consequences, but it comes with something far more important: integrity. Jung taught that freedom begins with the willingness to stand alone, to walk away from applause, to disappoint the crowd in order to stay loyal to your soul. Most people won't do this. They'll keep wearing the mask, keep chasing acceptance, keep folding themselves into smaller versions of who they are, because being approved of feels safer than being free. But for those who make the cut, who walk through that inner fire and emerge unattached to the need for validation, the world changes. You no longer adapt yourself to survive in rooms that don't value you. You walk into those rooms with your head high, knowing that if they don't see your worth, that's not your problem. It's your exit sign. When you stop chasing validation, a profound shift occurs, not only in how others see you, but in how you begin to hear them. Conversations you once took at face value begin to reveal their layers. The compliments that once flattered now feel calculated. The concern that once comforted now feels conditional. Because you've stopped needing the performance, you begin to see the script. Carl Jung taught that once the unconscious becomes conscious, it loses its power to control you. That's exactly what happens when you finally detach from the need to be liked. You begin to decode manipulation in real time. You hear when people disguise dominance as advice. You hear when support is laced with envy. You hear when someone's just being honest is really just masked cruelty. These things used to fly under the radar because your radar was tuned to one channel. Do they like me? Now that channel has gone dead. You're listening from a different frequency and suddenly the noise is obvious. And when you stop reacting to it, you become dangerous. Not because you've become aggressive, but because you've become immovable. You no longer rise to bait. You don't chase approval. You don't rush to defend yourself every time someone misrepresents you. You hear the manipulation and you let it pass. That silence, that non-response, it's your power, and it terrifies people who are used to pulling your strings with ease. But let's be clear, emotional detachment is not about indifference. It's not about becoming a cold, closed-off version of yourself. It's about filtering what deserves access to your emotional life. You no longer offer your energy to every voice that wants attention. You no longer play referee in other people's unresolved chaos. You choose what enters your world, and you let the rest self-destruct without you. And that choice, the choice to preserve your energy, is an act of psychological maturity. Jung believed individuation was the process of becoming whole. That doesn't mean becoming perfect. It means integrating your shadow, owning your instincts, knowing your boundaries, and refusing to betray yourself just to avoid discomfort in others. It means understanding that you're not responsible for managing everyone's perception of you. You're responsible for your own integrity, and that's more than enough. People will notice, some will respect it, some will resent it, but you will no longer be a mirror for other people's projections. You won't reflect their need to be admired, obeyed, comforted, or obeyed. And when they see they can't control your reflection anymore, they'll call you names: cold, arrogant, detached. But that's fine, because when you stop explaining yourself, when you stop justifying your no, when you stop dressing up your boundaries to make others comfortable, you step into a silence that speaks louder than anything you could say. That silence isn't absence, it's presence, and it shakes the ground for those who only knew how to relate to your approval-seeking self. Let them stumble. You've stopped performing. You've started living. The day you stop needing validation is the day your relationships change, and not always in ways you expect. When you no longer orbit around other people's approval, some will see it as liberation, but others will experience it as abandonment. Not because you've left them, but because you've left the role they were used to assigning you, the helper, the fixer, the pleaser, the one who always made space for their chaos, their moods, their needs. When you withdraw from that dynamic, not with anger, but with clarity, it exposes the imbalance. It reveals who actually respected you and who only tolerated you as long as you stayed small. Carl Jung warned that the masks we wear become traps. They don't just conceal our truth from others, they bury it from ourselves. And when you take off that mask, when you stop performing politeness, compliance, or false humility, those who depended on your performance start to panic. They miss the version of you that needed their validation to feel worthy, the one who never challenged them, the one who never said no, the one who took emotional bullets in silence just to keep the peace. And suddenly they say you've changed. Not because you became cruel or distant, but because you stopped apologizing for existing. You stopped managing their feelings at the expense of your own. You stopped showing up to conversations that were always one-sided. And in doing so, you broke a silent contract, the unspoken agreement that your self-worth would always be negotiable. But here's the truth. It was never your job to keep other people comfortable in their dysfunction. It's not your duty to carry their projections, absorb their anger, or be their emotional shock absorber. When you detach from that role, it doesn't make you selfish, it makes you self-possessed. And that difference is everything. Because once you reclaim your emotional autonomy, people have to relate to you as you are, not as the fantasy they projected. No more walking on eggshells, no more explaining basic boundaries, no more pretending that mistreatment is just love in disguise. You see clearly now. And clarity, once earned, doesn't go back in the box. Not everyone will come with you. Some relationships will end. But what remains, what survives the fallout, is truth, mutual respect, emotional accountability, real connection built on honesty, not performance. That is the gift of emotional detachment. It doesn't kill love, it purifies it. It burns away the manipulation, the obligation, the emotional games. And what's left is something clean, real, free. You are no longer here to be liked. You are here to be whole. Freedom isn't loud. It doesn't come with fireworks or applause. Often it arrives quietly, on a day when you choose not to respond to an insult, when you stop explaining yourself to someone who's already made up their mind, when you walk away from a situation not out of defeat, but because you finally realize that your peace costs too much to be bartered for temporary approval. That's the quiet power of detachment. It looks passive to the untrained eye, but in reality, it is a declaration. I am no longer available for anything that shrinks me. Carl Jung understood this deeply. He believed that real strength wasn't about domination or control, but about self-possession. The ability to hold your ground internally, regardless of what's swirling around you. Detachment isn't indifference. It's not numbness. It's not apathy. It's the opposite. It's being so grounded in your own reality, so anchored in your own values, that the external noise no longer dictates your emotional weather. People confuse emotional detachment with coldness because they mistake boundaries for barriers. But let's be clear, walls are built from fear. Boundaries are built from wisdom. Detachment is not the abandonment of love. It's the removal of illusion. It's the choice to stop basing your self-worth on how well you're received. And once you cross that threshold, you don't just think differently, you feel differently. You start to recognize the energy behind words. You start to feel when someone's presence is a transaction in disguise. You stop arguing with people committed to misunderstanding you. Not because you've given up, but because you've leveled up. You start protecting your peace with the same intensity you used to protect your people-pleasing. You stop explaining your number. You stop apologizing for your yes. You choose rest over performance, silence over drama, truth over approval. And each of these small, powerful choices rewires something inside you. It teaches you that you are no longer dependent on anyone's permission to be whole. And once that awareness sets in, there's no going back. You're not triggered by the same bait. You're not reactive to the same games. You don't fall for the same manipulation. Why? Because you've stopped needing external validation to feel internal peace. You've stopped auditioning for roles in other people's stories. You're writing your own, and you're not handing out pens anymore. This is what Jung meant by becoming individuated, a person who is no longer divided by the need to please others and the truth of their own soul. You're no longer available for the performance. You are now loyal to your own becoming. The world doesn't know what to do with someone who no longer needs to be seen, who no longer flinches when ignored, who no longer rearranges themselves just to fit in a room. When you stop chasing validation, you become unpredictable. You stop dancing for attention, and in doing so, you shift the dynamic. Suddenly, people can feel the difference. You walk into a room, and your presence speaks before you do, not because it demands anything, but because it needs nothing. Carl Jung taught that wholeness doesn't come from being loved by the world. It comes from integrating your shadow, owning every part of yourself, and no longer being fragmented by the opinions of others. And that's the danger. That's the power. When you no longer depend on applause to feel worthy, you become immune to manipulation. You become ungovernable. Because no one can buy the approval of someone who doesn't need to be approved of. This is where you start to see clearly who's been keeping you small, who's been feeding off your insecurity, who only stayed close because they had power over you. And when the performance ends, those people leave. But let them. That exit is your liberation, because every time someone walks away from your truth, you get closer to the life you were actually meant to live. There's a kind of peace that comes when you stop explaining yourself, a kind of power that rises when you stop making yourself digestible, when you stop translating your truth into a language that others can accept. You stop arguing, you stop proving, you stop overextending yourself in the name of being understood. You start choosing what aligns, not what pleases. And from that place, the path becomes clear. You stop asking, do they like me? And start asking, do I respect myself when I'm with them? You stop chasing closure from people who were never open to begin with. You stop needing to be chosen. Because you realize you already were the moment you chose yourself. This is what Jung meant when he spoke of the self, the center of your being that holds everything together once you've stopped outsourcing your identity to the world. It's not about becoming perfect, it's about becoming whole. And the most dangerous person in any room will always be the one who knows that wholeness isn't found in how others see them. It's found in how deeply they've seen themselves.